Nau mai hoki mai anō, I te iwi, ki tā te whakāturanga ākia, ko hoki mai anō ki tō tātou kai kōrero a Marise Lant. Rāua ko Professor Mohan Dutta I te atanei, māku te karakia tuku, he whakariti tā tātou hui. Mihi atu anau ki a Ranginui, ki a Papatuanuku, ki te taiao, ki ngā toa Maori, ka puti ani a tātou. Ka tukuna hoki te whakaaro whānui ki ngā whānau aho ko ki whi rātou e noho ana. Kia tau mai hoki te māramatanga, kia manaaki hoki tātou titi ki titihi riri hau pai māriri. Kia ora.
Kia ora. So we get to share with you today the work that Marise and I have been doing for the last 5 days, and it's been such a joy to have this conversation with you, Marise. And the way we have been doing it is actually talking first and recording the conversation, and then going in and writing it out as much as possible to reflect the concepts that Marise discussed. So what we thought we would frame this conversation as is to look at anti-racism as the basis for dismantling the whiteness that inhabits structures, specifically institutions, organizations, and broader society, and as Marise highlighted, embedded in legislation. And we thought the way we will look at it in terms of outlining strategies is by talking about connecting across cultures. Marise, do you want to say something before I put the layout?
Yes, thank you, Professor Mohan, and it's been a long week, a lot of work, and I hope that what we can offer back from these presentations is something that we can all work with, and I think change needs to happen there. We need to find some solid foundations and platforms for us all to go forward on.
Thank you, Marise. So what we thought we will do is we will begin by talking about the importance of looking at connections as a way for joining the dots, as Marise said, between anti-racist struggles, whiteness, and structures. And one of the points, Marise, that you made consistently is that struggles against racism often stop at a surface level, or they're often superficial, such that they fail to look at the embedded structures. And one of the things we will argue here is that we actually need to look at the ways in which whiteness seeps into these structures and shapes norms and customs. Then we will talk about ways in which we can culturally center connections. Then we will discuss how these connections need to be rooted in Maori knowledge, and then how that is the basis for transforming structures. This is an image from the context of the Aboriginal struggles in Australia, and we put this image because it in many ways captures or reflects one of the key threads in our conversation throughout this week, and I think that was the most beautiful part of these conversations, Marise, is how you pointed to this notion that Captain Cook arriving in Aotearoa is not independent of the white colonial masters arriving elsewhere in other parts of the globe and leaving similar kinds of impacts of the violence of colonization.
Yes, and I think we needed to look at that, not in the context in which it was portrayed out by the media, but from the grassroots levels in which they arrived and how it gave effect and impacted on the Indigenous peoples and the lands in which they arrived on. And the whitewashing of that whole concept was to stipulate that we've got whakapapa because we have a history back in the UK, and that needs to be acknowledged, and it needs to be put out there that we want our own history come into the history of what happened here with Maori. And I think we need to separate the two, because they are totally different in the context of what's happened during that time and era and also today. And
part of that, Marise, as you pointed out, is we feel that what is at the heart of anti-racist struggles is dismantling the myth-making of whiteness, the continual production of stories that are often filled with lies that portray a particular kind of story of colonization, and at the same time erase the violence, the genocide, the rapes that are built into it.
And a lot of that comes back again to the history, the way in which it's been taught, who's teaching it to Māori and Indigenous families around the motu, and where the framework fits in. And it's important to note that if the structure is not designed with the genuine intent to allow the Indigenous people of the lands to tell their stories, their Pāki Waitara, the way it was correctly, it is never likely to service those Indigenous peoples, and in this particular case, Māori.
So let's unpack a little bit in terms of what we mean by whiteness and connect it to the idea of structures and racism. So whiteness might be thought of as a set of norms, cultural codes, cultural practices that are built into it, into society as legitimate ways of operating society. So the ways in which whiteness works is by setting up rules and codes that are embedded within white culture, but these rules and codes are often invisible because we are all embedded within them and they become normative.
That's correct. It's another way of validating the conceptions that if it's a design that's been put in by the colonizer, it is going to be the best alternative for those Indigenous groups. And it's important for us to note that when that occurs, we're going through that beginning transition of colonisation that actually removes those rights of Indigenous people, slowly but surely, and also when it's disguised under the different structures, not always is it obviously clear, but it's there in context and in its written format. And I think we need to be aware of that, be alert, and approach these issues cautiously, especially when it's indentured or entrenched into legislation.
You know, one of the great examples that you gave, Marise, that to me was so eye-opening was when you talked about child, youth, and family services and the ways in which that structure is organized.
And the design will always be the design. If Māori have never had any input into it, or an Indigenous group has never had any input into it, and if they did, what extremes is it going to change in order to effectively give change to who it's going to impact on the most? Oranga Tamariki is a classic example of let's change the name and let's change the face, but not what's happening internally. And if you have the stats that prove that it is impacting on Māori Pacific Island families or whānau, and they are calling out for change, why are we not doing it? And I think it's a reality that's come to the forefront now because that's what we're discussing. It's a classic example of where change needs to happen. And the dismantling of a structure that's not working is not just not working for Māori, but actually not working for everyone.
A great, and when we were talking about this, I was also thinking about the analogy. So one analogy is, I think about it in the context of colonization in India, and the ways in which white Christian missionaries set up the church as a space for salvation, or so it would be portrayed, that the church was actually saving these children from their own and from their families, and actually what the church was doing throughout the whole process was destroying the fabric of the families, destroying the culture, destroying the whānau structure.
The church had its own agenda in which it came on. It is a huge contributor to colonisation and the inception of colonisation in Māoridom. And we're still doing that in a lot of the areas on our marae. We're still practicing the religion that's not necessarily ours, but it was brought in by colonisers. Now, in saying that, not all of the beliefs are necessarily bad, but just like everything else, you take what you need, leave the rest behind. But don't take the lot and allow it to remove the land. Because our whakapapa, as Indigenous people, has always been to our whenua. If we allow the concepts of another culture to encroach on ours, then we are allowing ourselves to be dominated. And that's where we find that in history it has shown us that is the biggest cause, or one of the biggest causes, is that we allowed ourselves to be dominated.
Which is why whiteness is an ideological formation, because it seeps into everyday structures, but it also seeps into the cognition or the ways of thinking of colonized peoples. So we start seeing the church as salvation, isn't it?
Some start seeing the church as salvation. I'm a descendant of the Kōti so you know there are different beliefs. What I tend to say to our people is you can't change history, you can only learn from it. And what we've learned from it is not all of it was good for us. No matter what it is portrayed in terms of the eyes of the colonizer, no one can portray what it looks like for the eyes of Maori. And those other countries, those other ethnic groups, those other migrant groups that have also been affected by colonisation. We have watched globally the travel of the different religions to different areas, and no more than the Christian. That's had impacts on all those areas in the Western country where there have been Indigenous people, where their lands have been removed by that same very vehicle. We call it a gifting of land, or a provision for reservations. But underneath those cloaks are shadowed with the intent of removing and alienating, and we're still practicing that. It's still being practiced today. When we have buildings where we have land situations and occupations on those buildings where the land's still not being returned to the Indigenous people or to Maori. What happens is the titles get changed from Maori title, and then often it's been either sold off but never returned, but it was yet gifted for a specific purpose. And that's a classic example right there of alienation of Maori land.
So in this sense, structures that are rooted in whiteness, we argue, they create detrimental impacts on the lives and livelihoods of indigenous communities and other communities of color. So they have real effects on health, well-being, on bodies, and you extend that further, and it gets to the Christchurch attack. So in that sense, we need to think about white supremacist attacks in continuity with this ideology of white supremacy.
And what does that look like? You know, what did it look like back in the 1800s or 1700s, and what does that look like today? Is it being seen as the same thing, or is it disguised in another different cloak than what it was back then? The only thing you can really think about, or we can really think about as a nation, is come back to where it starts. And it always will start with the design of the system that's in place. If the system is designed by the colonizer, then that is more than likely going to be the person or the beneficiaries of that design. Whether it looks like an area or a structure that has a bit of tainted colouring within it. If we start adding a few Maori words here, adding a few structures here that might be perceived to look like they represent Maori, the question is, how was that exercised? Everything is about how was it exercised. Because it's easy to put a label on something and say that this is the intent, that we're going to implement a framework under treaty principles. But leave it there to gather dust without exercising what that actually means is the key problem to transformations and building relationships that aren't actually happening.
So this is a way to depict what we mean by connections, and it's a way for conceptualizing this paper. The image on the bottom left-hand corner is when the crown appeared in India. And the right-hand corner, of course, you're familiar with, is the arrival of Captain Cook. So when you talk about the 250 years of colonization, its violence and detrimental impact, the murders and the genocides, those two connect across spaces. And embedded within that is also the treachery, the turning of particular acts of gift giving, particular acts of opening up that indigenous peoples often did into actually sites of violence through the deployment of lies and various forms of co-optation.
And that is the memoir that has been left with Māoridom when we opened our arms and care with aroha, we were welcomed with violence. And that is the perception of our history on the arrival of the Endeavour and its replica to Ranginuiakiwa, and also around the country. It carried on for centuries, and even today, even though it might not be seen the same way, we're now dealing with high numbers of violence, domestic violence, methamphetamine use, suicide, addictions, all congruence of colonisation. And the issue that we're really facing is that we need to address that contemporary look or view of what colonisation looks like today. Because we tend to go back to the history, and yes, the history is important, but coming forward, what have we learned from that? How is it we're still following the same pathway and structures of the coloniser that only tends to give us a bit of leeway? Just enough to allow us to have a little voice, but not enough to change the structure itself. And that needs to happen. It needs to happen now, while we are continuing to look at growing our families, working in a collaborative approach, working with allies, building better relationships, because it doesn't just stop at Māori. You've highlighted here in this clear depiction, and it is also prevalent around the globe with other Indigenous groups, other colonised groups that aren't necessarily ethnic either. And we go back to the Welsh, we go back to the Irish, we go back to the areas that were colonised in Europe. We need to build our relationships in Aotearoa with those groups that are also being colonised and strengthen it, because the design that's currently here isn't working for anybody. And if it works for Māori, then it will work for you. But when we're not even given the chance to actually affect those changes with a genuine relationship with the Crown, then it's unlikely to occur.
So, Maurice, something else that was really powerful through this conversation is in terms of the deployment of the term culture and how it is utilized. So you see, there is a trick that is played here in terms of the language of culture. So on one hand, when you think about Oranga Tamariki, for instance, and the narrative that Indigenous culture is lazy, Indigenous culture is violent, that narrative is perpetuated to reproduce whiteness. But also what that leaves intact is the culture of whiteness, which is violent, which is colonizing, which erases, and which has had a systematic history of rapes and murders. So we cannot talk about, and this is why I think your concept of how we look at, for instance, methamphetamine use, or within the context of violence, within familial context, that needs to be connected to these broader narratives on the culture of whiteness.
You know, the ideology that's taught often through institutions and organisations, for us as Māori, it's taught from birth. It is taught, they're not born with it. And when I say that, I refer to the structures that are in place that push our children through educations. Institutions that back in the 80s, they're still talking about the label groups of which you should belong to. And for many Māori who can actually whakapapa to different groups, it was very difficult back then to stipulate in a classroom where I was raised in that you belonged to several other groupings. In saying that, the behaviours that are taught within institutions are often carried forward through the students, it's implemented through the work they do, and it's then practiced and exercised out in the public arena, depending on who the actual teachers are. The best thing that could have happened was to allow the teachings at home to be always at the forefront, and allow the people to continue to perceive your best teachers are your people and are at home. Everything else is secondary, and only the advantages from what you're getting out in the public arenas is what you take on board. If it impacts change that's negative for your people, don't take it on board. And it doesn't matter where it's taught in.
So the theme of our paper then is to connect across. Marise, I will ask you to explain that.
Okay, a lot of the discussions we've had this week is that how do we bring a collaborative approach together? And one of the things that really is clear and needs to be highlighted is that the struggles that we hold as Māori, and some may have heard this before, but it is pivotal that we raise this now. The struggles that Māori are having now are no different than the struggles that non-Māori from ethnic groups and refugees are facing as well. The issue is identifying when often those groups are pitted against one another, and it's not necessarily a skin colour thing, it's more about politics and the way in which benefits are going to come out of that is used to manage and control the various groups. And that has been a huge impact and has been a strategy that has been deployed by the coloniser since the arrival. And it must be seen as that. It must be seen that we are looking at the design, the structures, the timing, and the way in which that strategy has been deployed. Often, we will find that those that are going to be affected by those decisions will be coming from the ethnic groups, the migrant groups, the refugee groups, and more so the indigenous groups of that land. Why? Because the design's not set up to benefit them at the forefront. And then you have the issue of, while we all are lobbied into one basket, when it's convenient and told that we are all one. Well, I'm not disputing that we're not all human. What I am disputing is the inequalities that exist amongst the different groupings. And that needs to be at the forefront of that argument. The inequalities that are existing amongst the different groups. That doesn't make us one. The fact that we have high numbers of incarceration, high numbers of Māori children being uplifted by ministries, and also a number of Māori that are now going through the effects and traumatisation of what's happened with colonisation. It didn't happen on its own. It started with the dismantling of the whānau structure, and that's the same strategy that can be seen and used around the globe.
Which is also why, racist groups like Hobson's Pledge use the argument we are all equal to erase over these deep inequalities that are produced.
Well, and I can understand that. I mean, the fear is that when you have a group like Hobson's Pledge, or any group that is clearly afraid of giving or sharing the power of ensuring that a community and a country is going to be fairly providing the needs of everybody when they've had control for so long, you can see the fear that's happening with groups like Hobson's Pledge. And they want to protect what's theirs or what's perceived to be theirs. And it's because of that viewpoint, everyone gets caught up in the race issues. And that's an issue when you've got a group that doesn't want to acknowledge that they may have to share their power. And it's a power-sharing struggle of white supremacists that continues to be at the forefront of every behaviour that they put in place. And we're no different when we have to deal with that. The difference is if we start dealing with it in single groups, not collectively, not just as ethnic, migrant, refugee, Māori, but also Pākehā, that have that clear ideology that, is this really what we want to look like going into the future? It's not. Our children need to build better relationships. We need to teach them and re-establish those values. We need to reconnect the dots with the different groups. And we need to learn, as a nation, that the best thing we could possibly do is do this collaboratively, not in separate silos.
Which is precisely the next point. So connecting for us, theoretically, is to see the whiteness, to witness the connections across struggles that are rendered as outcomes of that balance of whiteness, the setting up of those norms and institutional structures, and then build relationships across struggles. So we spent quite a bit of time talking about the hard work of actually crafting, creating, maintaining, and sustaining relationships.
And the way forward and the stepping stones to create those structures is to get input, get suggestions, have discussions, work together, but ensure that at the forefront of all of that, the Indigenous people who have for centuries protected not only the whenua, but also Aotearoa Māori worldview, is probably the most pivotal stepping stone forward to creating a better nation, is with the Indigenous people, Māori. In terms of everyone else that comes outside that area, you're not actually outside that area. What you're doing is you are now having input, opening the doors to creating a better nation for the future generations. And that's what this is really about. It's about the future generations. And if we can't make a model and dismantle the one that's not working, and the only way to dismantle it is actually from the inside, not the out. And re-establish what that model looks like, because it doesn't necessarily mean that you've got to find a totally independent model. You can strip from the inside and review and replace. And it doesn't necessarily have to look any more like the colonisers' model. It can be a model that is reflective of, first and foremost, Māori and Indigenous treaty rights, and every other treaty that's affected as well. But it is inclusive. For those people that understand Māori at grassroots and he kaupapa Māori he tikanga, they will know by those points that are up there and more that it embraces everybody. What's good for Māori is good for you. What isn't good is what we've been doing now.
It would be lovely if you talk a little bit about how you draw upon the concept of aroha with Manuhiri. I thought that was really interesting for us to rethink the relationship with refugees and migrants.
Just as we did on the arrival, you know, some might say it was a bit naive when we looked back and thought, well, okay, we're opening our arms up to allow the arrival of the Endeavour, and didn't realise what we were bringing in. Our aroha was at the forefront. Our aroha as Māori normally is at the forefront of everything we do. Without that, it takes away a lot of the context of what we are. What I say in this day and age is that aroha is something we need to protect as well. So when we are openly sharing our aroha, we need to be careful who we're sharing it with. That's the reality. So we don't fall back into history repeating itself. Manaakitanga, well, we are a manaakitanga. All of these 4 points are the things that we actually practice on our own marae and our own tikanga. And, you know, the thing is, we don't turn people away. We've never turned people away. But because of what's happening, the internal structures and the behaviours that have taken place that have traumatised our people, intergenerational traumas have to a certain extent made us or put us in a place or enforced, like what's happened with the COVID, a change in what these look like. A change in what they look like. So that contemporary ideology now and the enforcement of the colonisers' worldview is now impacting on us again. It's now impacting on us again because we're getting told what we can do in our marae. What does that look like? Who can we bring on? And so once again, it's being reciprocated. And in some instances, we may have to make some necessary changes to protect our culture and our people. But it's who and how that's done. Manaakitanga, we're a people of Manaakitanga. When we look at how the migrants, or in particular the refugees, I have to go back to the refugees, because they come from war-torn countries. War-torn countries that we as a colonised nation have in previous years contributed to the support of the wars that have taken place in those countries. It wasn't us, but we have this rendition right now is that we're all one, or they are us. Well, I can say they're not me, they're not Māori. We don't go to war on other people's lands, yet we have followed the colonisers into war on other people's land. And I refer back to my own tupuna have gone to war. You know, and with the ideology that you're protecting your country, unfortunately, from my view, and I say that from my view, we should have been protecting our hukainga, because now we're in this situation, and I don't believe that that anything else can be further from the truth of us having to not show our manaakitanga to our, especially our refugees whānau. I mean, because there's not enough talked about on the areas that they come from, the trauma that they've come from, and we are a Manaaki people, we are an Aroha people. If we are not that, then that takes away a lot of our beliefs. So we need to remember that when we start talking it, we need to exercise it. And also create that space and that umbrella for them to feel safe, because we should know what it's like to deal with the coloniser here. We've had more practice than anybody on what that looks like. And offer them a space. Remember, at a certain point in time, the different groups are always likely to be the victims of the coloniser, and it normally comes around every election time.
You know, you talked about a beautiful idea when we were chatting, Marise. It was about interacting with refugees as cultural sovereigns. So do you feel comfortable sharing that mosque story that you...
Oh, well, you know, we've been always stipulated, we've driven the kaupapa that, you know, we're so used to just dealing with the colonisers in terms of who we lease our land to, farming environment, any type of lease that's going out. We've always only dealt with our English counterparts, but there has, or our Asian counterparts. But what I want to highlight for Māori is that we have options when we broaden our horizons and we start sharing what we can consider to be our own independence and sovereignty may come alongside alliances that we build with other ethnic and refugee groups and Pacific whānau. One of the things that I had proposed was, if somebody came to me and said to me, Marise, we're looking to lease some land, and we would like to look at Māori land as a way to lease. What's the difference if that person is coming from a religion that is Muslim as opposed to a religion that is Christian? And Māori history has shown we have been dealing with Christian in terms of leasing Māori land and setting it aside as reservations, but we have not got back a lot of that land. And in doing so, what we need to do is, this is a classic example of trying to broaden our horizons. We are still in control of Māori titled land. We have an opportunity to open those doors. It's up to us whether we do it or not. Now, I'm not saying everyone go out there and lease your land to the Muslims that are going to come in and build a mosque. I'm not saying you can do that automatically. What I'm saying is give thought to who we want to do business with, because that's a way of building our relationships. How bad can it possibly have been there? What I've been seeing happening now, we're coming back to deal with climate change, a lot of issues around farming, a lot of issues around forestry, which has impacted on us on the East Coast. And we have leased our lands to different groups. That's okay, but we need to monitor it a bit more. We need to monitor and remember who we're actually going to be doing business with. Aroha is one thing, cautious approach is another.
So this, is a nice segue to the next concept, which is the idea of anchoring multiculturalism in Maori treaties, and which sort of is a critique on one hand of multiculturalism, which in itself is built on the notions of whiteness, and so moving that center by rooting multiculturalism in Te Tiriti o Waitangi. Do you want to talk about that?
Well, I'm going to go back to the story we just had, because it might actually be a better example. I can choose to have an agreement with anyone I like on my land, as long as we're, again, addressing some of the legislative issues that are going to come up from that. If I want to lease land, the agreement can be between me and you, not necessarily me, you, and a third party to watch over. It's important that we understand how trade will affect our relationships into the near future as Māori. I think building bridges, I think allowing different cultures to get a bird's eye view from us directly is going to help build those relationships. The treaty principles, understanding the treaty principles, having that direct engagement into communities at the forefront of when our manuhiri arrive is important. There needs to be that clear framework within immigration and refugees' transformation into New Zealand. It must have that Māori component at the forefront. What does that look like? So that when they do arrive here, they know very clearly that when they are going to be integrated into a community, one of the most important points that they should and would relate to, dependent on the countries they're coming from, that the relationship they have with actually that tangata mana whenua of the land is a lot closer than they actually thought. And it's because of the things we've been talking about. And moving together to effect changes will actually assist in the transformation change that needs to happen in Aotearoa.
Which sort of brings forth this idea of cultural sovereignty, and thinking about cultures as sovereigns and having the registers for connecting with each other outside of the parameters of whiteness.
And it's important because different ethnic groups and cultures connect on the same level, because when they come to Aotearoa, they're away from their home, and not necessarily because they want to. Some are forced to go into areas where they feel safer because they're coming from the war-torn countries. They're coming from all of the terror and the anarchy that's going on back in their homelands around wars. I mean, we've got to have that sense of aroha within us as a people to understand that. And the connection is, do they understand us? Well, they don't understand us if we're not having that put in the forefront of what's being delivered to migrants and refugees that come into this country. It is not controlled by a coloniser. It is something that needs to be recognised, acknowledged and implemented and exercised in terms of the Treaty of Waitangi. And Māori need to be driving at the forefront of almost every sector across the ministry. It can't be just the tick box exercise of tokenism. We have to take risks when we see that something is not right, especially if we work within these organisations. Speak up, speak out and make it happen. If we are just there to tick that box, we are no more better than delivering and puppeteering and mimicking what is happening through the coloniser. We're actually giving effect to that.
Which is why, this idea of creating registers outside whiteness is so important, right? Sovereignty makes us aware that we need to constantly be thinking about what are these registers we are working through.
And how do we get the information out? How do we share it? Because people do tend to feel uncomfortable in these sessions that are going out there because we're directly addressing some of the history and their whakapapa. But the reality of it is that by acknowledging and making it clear that you're going to take a stand on issues surrounding Māoridom and support that, it builds the relationships where we're getting away from the differences that are occurring and really addressing the problem is where it started from. Because too often is that the barrier that's thrown in front of the general public and people of non-Māori descent, and that's what they roll with. The propagandas, the stereotypes, the labelling, and that becomes offensive, so it builds up the ante and you get all of these forces working at once. And they work against one another. So what really happens is that we get distracted. And while we're getting distracted, laws get made. Bills get rushed through. Land gets taken. Land gets sold. Amendments are made in terms of different bills for confiscation. Maori consultation gets ignored. Migrant voices get ignored. Refugees' voices get ignored. And all the different groups will follow that don't conform with the structure. And it needs dismantling. It needs dismantling now.
Which is why we also feel that it's really vital to see anti-racism as beyond running a multimedia campaign for a month, which can be good, but it is much more than that. It is about struggles for land, water, air, struggles against the dismantling of the whānau, struggles against incarceration, you know.
And, you know, the terminology that's often used by the colonisers is the one that causes the offence. It causes the offence because when we use the term ownership, Māori don't need to claim ownership of something we've always had. But we are definitely have that right, those customary rights to implement what we believe keeps Aotearoa Māori worldview safe. And what's happening is that because of that total disregard of and ignorance, on purpose in some instances, we're getting the backlash too often that's normally put out there and portrayed by media. So people that are in fear and aren't aware of how Māori function and operate, have never had a relationship with us, what they tend to do is pick that up and roll with what the propagandas have been put out there. If people are feeling that the only view that they have of Māori is the one that's portrayed in the media, then take the step to build a relationship with somebody that is Māori. Because if you don't start there, then you're not going to know. Your only information, that is 9 times out of 10 misinformed information, is coming off the social media, off the news, and spread out through journalism, then pumped through politics and ends up here. So dismantling colonisation starts. It starts with you as an individual on what are you doing about it and how can you affect change to acknowledge, respect the people of the land here, and how can you then work together to ensure that all of these things around water, whenua, air and customary rights are acknowledged and adhered to in terms of the treaty principles.
And this also then connects with this idea about struggles against whiteness and education, because one of the things you kept saying throughout these 5 days is that these policies that expel people from land, from customary rights, are actually carried out by people that are trained in educational institutions.
And we couldn't be any closer to the truth than that, because we come back to what are they being taught, because they become the policy developers, the policy makers. They become the ones that are normally hired into government sectors, into ministries, and this is where they get the flow-on effect from in terms of where they hire. The issue is that who is teaching the students about Māori health if this lecturer is not Māori, and at grassroots has never had that experience? Who is teaching about racism if it's not somebody that's had an ethnic background, a refugee background, or has had the impact in this colonial system and had that education in the public forum, in the private forum, because you're coming from a space that you may not have had that. And I'm not saying that that's the case with all lecturers, or all academics, or all students, but we're dealing with a structure that is often created by academics that are hired in state sector ministries and that turn out the delivery of that bureaucratic process. And where is that going to change? It depends on who's teaching them, what they're teaching them, and how they're delivering it. And we're behind the 8 ball. We're a couple of decades, if not centuries, behind the 8 ball, because this has been carrying on, and it is a form of assimilation, is allowing institutions to go unmonitored and regulated within those institutions on what they practice and what they deliver out. And it is important that Māori, as the treaty partner, have independent assessors sit across the board in all ministries, independent from the government and the organisation.
So, and that connects with this idea of dismantling structures. So it's really vital that we learn the habits of the structure, the rules of whiteness, to dismantle them. But I love this quote from you, Marise, and that will stay with me. Take what you need and leave everything else.
Yes, and that was a quote that my tupuna always said to me. The biggest fear that they had was sending their mokapono, their children, away to an institute like universities that came back and they were no longer their children, they became the children of the system. And in doing so, if you've got strong family values, strong whānau, then you are lucky enough to maintain it. But once you become disconnected, it is very difficult to become reconnected. And we've got to remember that. Ko au te whenua, ko te whenua ko au. If the bureaucrats are making policies and legislation that is going to remove us from our land, in effect, they will remove us from our whakapapa. End of story. Because our land is us, and we are the land, and everything around it. And that is pivotal in terms of whānau structures. We must maintain our whānau structures. Stay close as a tight community, as a tight nation, to try and overcome the issues that are coming out. And it's not necessarily what you see, it's what is coming behind it.
Which is why you say that educating and being informed is so important. Like you were giving those examples about the land-related legal reforms that were happening, and one wouldn't have any idea unless they were paying attention.
And a lot of that comes back with understanding the internal mechanics of how the system works. The Te Ture Whenua Bill was huge. It had a huge impact that would have been detrimental not just to Māori but also to everybody else. And a part of that was my drive forward on the Te Ture Whenua reforms. It was the first bill in 30 years that got pulled off the table in Parliament. And it took a lot of work, a lot of campaigning, and a lot of research in terms of what was going to be acknowledged changes through the government. Had that experience of not working within that actual system and identifying the flaws that are contributing or would have contributed to more or further Māori alienation of land, it would have gone through. Because you had to have worked in the system to know where the flaws are. You have to have worked in the system to understand the changes that we're going to be made. We're going to have detrimental effects on Māori and land titles.
So, I thought when it came to this idea of decolonizing education, I'll use this image of your anti-TPPA protest as the basis of this, because it creates a different register for thinking about the role of education.
It does, and we often just work in one specific category as educators, and that's the subject we want to focus on. But in reality, one area is not different from the next because they're still connected to the same beast. And unless we learn to vary the subjects that we're teaching in institutions, we're going to have forever struggles in different areas. It's a bit like an octopus. The legs are all moving and the tentacles are moving all at once, and you can't actually keep track of it.
So you have to be really flexible.
You have to be flexible. The key is being flexible not only to who we do business with, who we make friends with, who we build alliances with, but it's also in what we teach.
And at the same time, one of the things that I take away from your message about decolonizing education is about questioning who are we accountable to, who are we answering to. So for us to be decolonizing ourselves as educators, it is about shifting that point of accountability to our communities, to those at the margins that actually struggle because of these structures.
Yeah, and they do struggle because we still in some way working in that colonised view. And they struggle because the exercise of what looks like sovereignty to them, it doesn't necessarily work today. What it means is that they need to change the approach on how they can make a difference to sovereignty and what that looks like. We can't march and push different kaupapa and then go home and leave it. We need to see it through. When there is a kaupapa that's there in the forefront, similar like the TPPA, the only ones that are going to affect change are the voters. But you've got to be voting first. If you're marching on a protest and you're not a voter, then there's very little change that will happen. All you're seeing is raising awareness. There needs to be more done. There has to be petitions. There has to be submissions. There has to be court action. There has to be references back to the United Nations. So it's not just about protesting on the day. It's about holding the government and the structure to account.
So we go back to how do we do this, and your idea is that we create independent assessors.
That is probably the best idea and the only way forward within that structure that isn't completely going to be dismantled overnight. We need independent Māori assessors and cultural advisors on the different institutes and organisations, and this is a classic one, is on institutions and universities. We should be looking at Māori assessors, independent from the university, independent from control, that's able to give a fair research-based data analysis of what's happening in the universities across the country, not just in one university, across the board. That recommendation should be made to the Minister for Change. And we start there, but we don't end there. It needs to continue on all of the ministry portfolios.
So to summarize and conclude, we see anti-racist interventions as being embedded in seeing connections across cultures, across struggles and across issues, embedded and led by Maori wisdom and ideas, leveraging connections across decolonizing structures, and then dismantling whiteness in organizational, institutional and societal spaces.
Led by Maori to benefit and offer that place of safe and health and well-being to everybody. It's important that I say that, led by Maori, for the benefit and structures in place for everybody. And in saying that, it's important because Maori are at the negative standing at the moment. You know, and most people would be saying to us, well, they already got enough problems to worry about. The problem is not just what's on the paper, it's the way it's drafted into legislation. It's the amount of power that's been allowed to share. It's the amount of propagandas that are put out there. And the issues we're facing is that we allow bureaucrats too much room to develop policies and legislation when they've never actually worked in the private sector, when they've never worked with the ethnic groups, and when they've never come back and asked for that consultation.
If it is led by Maori, and if it is good for Maori, it is good for all.
It is good for everyone. And that's the alternative. That's the only alternative we have, is to build our relationships with our different, and when I say different, I like the different colour codes. I look at the rainbow, I like that. I think it's good we have a rainbow. It's just that one colour cannot be seen to be beaming above everything else. And it seems to be only one colour, and that colour's not in the rainbow. So it's change, it's transformative change that requires radical actions. Because too many times we're complacent, we don't want to upset anybody. I'm sorry, it's at the time now, and it's obviously glaringly clear. Right now is the change, and it requires radical action.
Thank you. with that, we will wrap up our speaks.
We've got a question from Facebook, Professor Marise, from our friend Jeremy from the Public Library in Palmerston North. He asks, so staying on the subject of welcoming and integrating new and former refugees appropriately in Aotearoa, what would you suggest?
Integrating them into Aotearoa. I think that a part of that framework policy of that the Immigration Department should implement is a pōhiri onto an actual marae. That would be a nice starting point. And not just that we go to the airport to give a brief welcome when there's a star coming to Aotearoa, but actually when they have the citizens swearing-ins on the councils, when they allow them to come in there, when they have migrants and immigrants coming through the borders, that they should be given information packs and being directed to take on te reo classes, information pamphlets from the wānanga, kura kaupapa, kohanga reo. The reo, even though I need to go back because I'm one of those recipients of colonised pathways, we were not given the opportunity, and the first tongue is ours. I think that even with our migrants and our immigrants, to integrate them into the communities, we need to have an induction pack that is very specific on the reo and where they can find that service in terms of reconnecting with government agencies that have that communication lens to hapu and iwi within those regions and build the capacity of that.
You also said something, which I thought was so brilliant, that, why aren't refugee and migrant children given the option of being educated in the kohanga reo?
Exactly, the kohanga reo was derived on retaining the reo and retaining Maori language. If that's not a part and parcel of the induction pack for new migrants to Aotearoa, where is the true treaty relationship? And how are the migrants that are coming into New Zealand and the refugees coming into New Zealand going to know that? And we can't reach out to every single person that comes off the plane. But I'll give you an example. When I catch a flight in and out of New Zealand, I don't see an induction plan there that's representative on those flights coming in.
Yeah.
That other than we're going to do a kapa haka show at a certain time, if you want to come over, you might go to this specific tourist area, but we don't have education packs on those planes. And they need them. Especially when we are having whānau coming in from war-torn areas, and that are going to struggle with the integration. It will also give our people as Māori an opportunity to link and have more in-depth knowledge about where refugees come from, how they are impacted, where migrants come from. Otherwise, what happens is that when they come here, some may still be in that traumatic state, or some may still be bringing behaviours that may actually be disrespectful to the hōkainga. So it's really about acknowledging and respecting that. And it's not anyone else but the structure and the Crown to see that that's implemented.
You also talked about building infrastructures for that bring refugee, migrants and Maori communities together in conversation.
And that's important. Like I've always supported the multicultural group in Tairāwhiti for a number of years. And one of the things that was significant is that they found it quite difficult to reach into that Maori component unless they knew somebody. Now that would be prevalent around the country. But if there is a whai wānanga in place, te wānanga Aotearoa raukawa, and we have them placed everywhere. A good stepping stone are the courses that they have there. They have brilliant courses at our Māori institutes that actually open that door for karanga, marae visits, te reo, and helps reintegrate them into their process, because then they get to meet more Māori on the courses, and they have tutors that are very supportive.
Any other questions from our audience here? Do you have Facebook questions, Richard? Okay. So this is our opportunity to wrap up then. I want to thank you, Marise, for these beautiful 5 days of learning, and I really hope that many of the knowledge that we have shared here, we are able to take forward and implement them. It's a long journey, but there are really good starting points here. Thank you.
Ngā mihi.